I've been a Christian for 45 years and I thought I knew the women of the Bible, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the past few episodes, we've explored 13 women whose lives were real, flawed, and pretty messy, just like ours. That's why their stories matter, because I believe their struggles shine a light on the places that we wrestle with too. And they show us something about God's heart for us as well. I'm going to tell you which of them carried me through some of the darkest moments of my life last year. And at the end of the video, I'll be sharing the 4 things these women's story taught me about how God actually sees me, and it's how he sees you too. And I want to start with the first woman who surprised me, because her story set the tone for everything that followed. So the first woman we're going to look at is Ruth and Naomi. I spent months with these women last year, and I think it was just God's perfect timing, because I was going through such a challenging time in my life, a period of transition. We were in the process of losing and saying goodbye to my niece, who sadly died of cancer at the end of the year. It was just really, really hard in so many ways. And as I dug into their stories, we see all these sort of like people swooping in and making it all right, don't we? In sort of like all the Disney movies. And God isn't a Disney hero. And actually, we see Ruth and Naomi go through some genuinely hard, really hard stuff. Ruth loses her husband, but Naomi loses both her husband and her sons, and she's stuck in a foreign country without all her friends and neighbours that know her and love her. And we see God take that story and weave it together to be, in the end, something beautiful, because he weaves their story and their tragedies, even those, into his story. And probably the most important thing I take away from their story is that there's so many times where it says, it just so happened that she went to Boaz's field, that the Kinsman Redeemer came past. It just so happened. And I think so often in our lives, when there seems to be like a coincidence, it's actually God orchestrating events. And so now I pay really close attention. When something just so happens and it feels like a coincidence, I just have my antennae out and I'm going, Holy Spirit, is this you? Is this something I need to pay attention to? And the second woman is Hagar. Of course, Hagar was a slave woman. And what we see in her story is that she ends up in the desert, not once, but twice. And she's alone, abandoned, and without any hope. And she's just crying out to God. And he shows up and reveals himself to her. And she calls him the God who sees me. And I love that we are seen by God. That's what it shows me, that we are seen by God. And yes, she ended up in the desert place more than once. But each time God met her, God showed up and he heard the cry of her heart. But it also tells me that finding yourself in the desert once, twice, or maybe 3 times, or whoever many times, for whenever I'm in those desert places, when I feel lost, when I feel like there's nobody else cares and I'm crying out to him, it gives me confidence that I am heard. And the next one we looked at was the widow of Zarephath. And I love her story because this woman, she's just so amazing. She's got enough food for her and her son for one last meal. She's not lying there going, oh, woe is me. She's out gathering sticks, doing what she can. And God meets her in the form of like sending Elijah and provides for both her and her son in this time of famine. And as we know, the jar of oil and the flour did not run out. I find that encouraging because so often when I go into something, I think I haven't got enough. I can't do this. I can't fix this on my own. I ask myself, what is the equivalent of the gathering of sticks? What's the thing that you can do? What's the thing you can do so that God can meet me in it? So that I'm going to do something and see that God meets me in it. And so that's what I can take out of that story. The next story we looked at was Hannah. And Hannah's story is of her being barren for years and having this awful situation where her husband takes another wife who has children and kind of taunts her. And each year they go up to Shiloh and she goes with this other woman and all her children, and it just emphasizes the what she hasn't got so much more. And Eli finds her, doesn't he, in the temple. He thinks she's drunk because she's crying out. She's just pouring everything out to God. And as we know, Eli says, you will have a son, and she conceives a son. He becomes Samuel, serving in the temple. And the one thing I take away from her story is it's okay not to have words. I often don't have words for what I want to ask God for. I love the fact that her story tells me that He hears the cry of our heart, even if it's just wordless, even if it's just tears. And that's a good thing. And the next woman we looked at was Martha. And I think sometimes Martha's story isn't really understood, because if you dig into it, I think it was Jesus saying, Martha, my friend, I know you've got all these cares and worries, but soon I won't be with you. Please come and spend some time with me. It was an invitation, not a correction. That reminds me when I'm really busy and often just like struggling to make time or to spend time with him, that actually it's not a, you naughty girl, spend time with me. It's just, hey, Jen, would you just come and spend time with me? I just want to hang out with you. And that just changes everything around. And next we looked at Deborah's story. And she's like this anomaly, isn't she? Because we've got all these male leader, male leader, male leader. And here comes Deborah, the prophet, sitting under a tree. And actually Barak, the leader of the armies, refuses to go into battle if she won't go with him. And it tells me that it's okay for women to be strong. It's okay for women to hear from God. It's okay for women to move in the prophetic. It's okay for women to take the lead in things. Because so often in the Bible, that's not what we see. But actually, Deborah's story tells me that that's okay. And next we looked at Jael's story, because her story is intertwined with that of Deborah. And I love Jael's story because at the point at which we meet her, she's not one of God's chosen people. And yet God uses her. He draws her in and says, come on, I have a plan and a purpose for you. This woman was a homemaker. She was in a tent in the desert. And suddenly this guy comes into her tent. And we don't know why. We don't know whether God spoke to her or quite what happened. But the enemy of the Israelites comes into her tent. She welcomes him. And as he falls asleep, she takes a tent peg, which must have been this long, and she drives it into his skull, and he dies there on the floor of her tent. And what I take away from her story is it's okay to be radical, to be different, to do something new that nobody ever has done before. It doesn't mean it's not a good thing. In fact, it might mean it is a good thing, because nobody had ever done that before, and probably nobody's ever done it since. But that was her God moment, doing something completely different, something unheard of. For me, when I'm thinking, could that possibly be God? I don't see anybody else doing it. That's okay, because I'm not made like anybody else, and neither are you. And the next woman's story we looked at was Abigail. Now, Abigail had a really foolish husband whose name was Nabal. Now, we don't have to assume he was foolish. The Bible tells us he was foolish, and his actions speak for him too. And actually, David has been looking after this guy's flocks. Now, Nabal is really rich. He's got hundreds of animals out on the hills. And David and his men have been caring for these flocks, making sure no raiders come in and harm them. And it's a feast day. And David comes in expecting to be welcomed, to be thanked. And he's saying, guys, we've done this. We want to have a feast day. Will you contribute? And Nabal goes, no, who are you? What is this David person anyway? And he is going to pay the price. David, incensed, comes out to kill him. And Abigail gets wind of this, grabs a whole bunch of supplies, jumps on a donkey and goes toward David to try and head off the slaughter which is coming to her household with David and his 50 men, I think. Her words are so wise. She turns it all around, because she doesn't say, oh, please don't kill me. She tells David how bad it will be for him to do what he's got in his heart or his mind to do. I find that encouraging, because I think so many of us find ourselves in difficult situations. Think about Abigail. She lived with this very difficult man day after day after day. But in that grew wisdom and courage. And in this very moment, she takes that courage and that wisdom and puts it to really good use. And that tells me that whatever our circumstances, God can be building that wisdom in us if only we're open to it and open to him. And the next two women we looked at were Shiprah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives in the story of Moses. And Pharaoh had issued a decree that every baby boy born was to be thrown into the Nile. And of course, as bringers of life, you can imagine how horrifying this must have been for the midwives. Pharaoh was a god. He was called a god. What he said had to be obeyed. And yet they defied him. And Shiprah and Puah not only defied his edict, but they got a little creative with the truth, saying that the Hebrew women gave birth too quickly. And what Shiprah and Puah's story tells me is that sometimes we're called to stand up for what is right, for what is fair, for what is just, and to put our hands on our heads above the parapet and say, This is what I believe, or no, I don't agree with that, because that's exactly what they did, even though they could have paid the price with their lives. Now, the next one we looked at was Jochebed, Moses' mother, and I think for me, this has been one of the hardest lessons to learn. And I think certainly as someone who has adult children and grandchildren, I got my first teenage granddaughter, this was a real lesson because it's all about letting go. Because Jochebed and her husband saw that there was something special in her son. And I don't mean oh, he's my son, he's awesome. But there was something over and above that, something of sense of God on this child. And they hid him for 3 months. She again got creative with Pharaoh's edict, because Pharaoh's edict that you must cast every baby boy into the Nile. Now she followed that to the letter, but got creative. So she wove a basket, covered it with pitch, made sure it was waterproof, then put her 3-month-old baby boy in it and put it in the reeds at the edge of the river. And because I think she couldn't bear to watch, she sent his sister Miriam to watch to see what would happen. And Jochebed's letting go was, as it were, the opening of the door for Moses to step into the future that God has for him. Because then he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter in the palace as a prince, was educated, given every privilege. And we know that Moses was God's chosen person to lead his people out of Egypt. But that only happened because Jochebed had the courage to let go. And for me, that's been the hardest lesson, because so often we want to go in and fix stuff, especially for our adult kids, but also for our grandkids. We just want to make everything okay, and we can't. And just letting go and trusting that God is somehow weaving all those smaller things into his bigger story, for me has been one of the hardest things that I am very much still on a journey with. And the final woman we looked at was Tabitha, who was also known as Dorcas. Now, Tabitha lives by the sea in Joppa, just down from modern-day Tel Aviv. She's nothing out of the ordinary from what you look at. She just sits at home, sews garments for her neighbours and friends. Nothing out of the ordinary, it would seem. But what she is doing with every single stitch, saying, you matter. I see you. You're loved. You're cared for. And for these widows who in that society felt overlooked and ignored, that was everything. And I love this story probably most of all because it says it doesn't matter what God's gifted you with. We've each been given different gifts. And instead of looking at this one or that one and saying, oh, I'd like her gift, oh man, I wish I could be like her, we need to ask what he's gifted us. For Tabitha or Dorcas, he'd gifted her with a really compassionate heart. He'd also gifted her with the skill at the needle, and he gifted her with an ability to bring women together so that when she dies, these women are distraught and they beg Peter to come, hoping against hope that he might be able to do something, because they just can't bear to lose this woman who has given them not only love and her compassion, but has restored their identity. Isn't that amazing that someone can have their identity and their worth restored by something as simple as someone sewing a garment? What this tells me is small things matter. We don't have to be the guy up the front. We don't have to be the person leading a team. Whatever it is that God's put on your heart to do, do it. Do those small things faithfully. I think we will never know until we get to heaven how much those matter, how important those things are. There's 4 things I've taken away from spending time with these 13 women of the Bible. And the first is that each of us is unique, created with purpose, and uniquely made. You can't get much difference than Deborah leading the army into battle and Tabitha in her little home by the sea, sewing her garments. But each of these women was unique, beautifully made, and created for a purpose. I love that because I'm a bit quirky, I'm a bit weird, I'm a bit rough around the edges, and I'm not quite sure sometimes what my place is. And what we've seen so much in each of these stories is that these women were seen, not just Hagar in the desert, but Jochebed as she places that basket in the reeds of the Nile, Hannah in the temple as she's pouring out her heart to God, and even Martha as she's busy behind the scenes feeling exhausted and stressed. He sees it all. I find it so helpful because as women, we're so often serving behind the scenes. We're wondering if anybody sees, and these stories tell me that he sees. that we are seen and he notices and he cares. And their stories tell me that we are heard. Not just our eloquent prayers, although I'm not very good at those, but the cry of our heart, our tears, even our yearnings and our dreams. He hears the cry of our heart. And as we've seen, sometimes the answer to those prayers can take years, but we are heard. But most of all, what I've taken away from this is that we are loved just as we are, not for who we want to be, not for who we hope to be, but we are loved. In all our messiness, in all our quirkiness, with all our rough edges, we are loved and we are treasured and we are precious to him. And our stories matter. Our stories matter to him, just as these women's stories mattered. So he wants to weave our stories into his bigger story. I want to say thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the last in this episode about the invisible women of the Bible. I'm going to be taking a break for the month of December, and we'll be back in January with a new series which I'm calling Coffee with Jen. But I'll be looking at some of the everyday issues we as women face and exploring some of my own stories which I'll be sharing with you, and how God wove himself in and around those stories as well. Just one more thing before we end. If you know someone who's really struggling but likes meaty devotionals, this is my Ruth and Boaz devotional. It's called Learning to Live in Challenging Times. It's the one that I wrote last year as I was going through this very difficult time, and I found their story so helpful to really get to grips with life when it's been tricky and to help me make sense of it. And the book based on this series, Invisible Women of the Bible, should be available by the 1st of January 2026. I want to say thank you so much for joining me here. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, remember, you are loved and God is not finished with your story yet.